Undoubtedly, the worst accident in history has a name: Germanwings 9525. Not because it had the most fatalities, but because what happened was a real nightmare. The plane was in perfect condition, maintenance had been done properly, and the weather was excellent. However, days before, that flight was already doomed. A story that shocked the aviation industry. No one had ever imagined that a pilot could be capable of such an atrocity. The surprising thing about this case is that it was the aviation industry itself that provided the ultimate weapon to this pilot. This is, without a doubt, one of the most complex stories in aviation, and today, at last, we are going to face it. On March 24, 2015, an Airbus A320 from the airline Germanwings took off at 9 in the morning from Barcelona Airport on runway 06R. The destination of this flight was Düsseldorf in Germany. Precisely for this reason, most of the passengers were German and Spanish, but actually, that day there were passengers of multiple nationalities. In total, there were 144 along with the 4 cabin crew members and 2 pilots, making a total of 150. The captain that day was Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, 34 years old and of German nationality. He had a total of 6,763 flight hours. Really, his profile was quite normal for someone who had recently been promoted to captain. The co-pilot, on the other hand, was Andreas Lubitz, 27 years old and of German nationality. He had 919 flight hours, of which 540 had been on the Airbus A320, and his record, unlike the captain's, had not been normal at all. But we'll talk more about this later. Everything related to the plane was as usual, maintenance was in order, and all systems were working properly. The case of Germanwings Flight 9525 is very well known in Spain, mainly because that flight departed from Barcelona. In fact, everyone knows it simply as the Germanwings accident. I want to make it clear that the purpose of this video is to explain what happened that led to that trap. The story is truly complex. The aviation industry always learns from accidents to prevent them from happening again in the future. That's why it's not enough to know that the co-pilot did it on purpose. We need to understand what circumstances led him to make that decision. And that's why everything we're going to see is not to justify what the co-pilot did, not at all. It's to understand what was going on in his mind, to prevent the same thing from happening in another pilot's mind in the future. To understand the first big problem of this case, we have to go back to September 11, 2001, the day aviation changed forever. Until that date, the idea that there could be someone among the passengers who would use a plane as a missile had never been considered. I have a video about these attacks detailing minute by minute what happened. As a result, aviation authorities saw the need to install security controls at airports. Passengers were separated from the pilots. In this way, aviation was guaranteed. The air. If a threat had slipped onto the plane, it couldn't reach the cockpit, but this caused a problem to appear. A problem that hadn't manifested until 14 years later. The threat. The plane could have the threat inside the cockpit itself. In this case, the armored door would serve as protection for the attacker, and he could do whatever he wanted with the plane, with no possibility for anyone to stop him. Certainly, the year before this tragedy, there was a disappearance in the air and it moved through the air. But just a year later, it was still not clear who was mainly responsible for the disappearance of that plane. This thing with the door shows how any variation in the processes, even with the best intentions, can cause a new problem to appear. That's why you have to be extremely careful when implementing changes in aviation. In the investigation carried out by the French Aeronautical Authority on the Germanwings 9525 accident, it is stated emphatically that the cause of this tragedy was a deliberate and planned action by the co-pilot who decided to take his own life when he was alone in the cockpit. The complication of this case, from my point of view, comes in the part that says planned action. What pilot could plan something like that? We begin with the disturbing story of Andreas Lubitz. Being a commercial pilot is something that costs quite a lot of money. There are multiple ways to go through the whole process, but Andreas Lubitz chose to apply to a program at Lufthansa, the most important airline in Germany. To be selected for this program, you had to go through several phases. First, there was a personality and general knowledge test, then one for leadership, cooperation, and communication, later one for multitasking and psychomotor skills, and finally, an interview. If you failed any of these tests, you were automatically disqualified from the program. Out of the 6,530 participants, only 384 passed the selection tests that year, which is 6% of the total. And among them was Andreas Lubitz. The good thing about this program was that if you passed it, you would start flying for one of the airlines in the Lufthansa group. The downside was that each participant had to pay 60,000 euros out of their own pocket up front. It might sound expensive, but it isn't, considering the number of licenses you earned with this program, plus you had a pilot job secured when you finished. The first step before starting was to get checked to verify that everyone was fit to fly. Andreas got it in April 2008, and this license would last him a year. A few months later, in September, the moment he had been waiting for finally arrived, the start of the course. But in November, he had to leave it for medical reasons. You see, to pay for the 60,000 euros for the course, Andreas took out a loan of 41,000, so he was under a lot of pressure to get good results during the course. Because if he didn't succeed, he would be left without his dream job and with a debt of 41,000 euros. This, according to reports, started to create a brutal anxiety situation for him, to the point that he had to take a break and leave the course for a few months. During all that time, Andreas went through a depression, which he fought with the help of antidepressants and psychiatric support. The problem is that when he wanted to resume his studies, his medical license had expired, and his depressive episode, along with the medication he was using, prevented him from renewing his medical license until July 2009. Once he was able to get it, he resumed his studies in August of that same year. However, in that last medical evaluation, something vital for this case happened. In the report, the doctors included an asterisk that led to a note saying that if he had another episode of depression, he would be permanently disqualified from flying. This asterisk would follow him forever in his medical records for the next 14 years. He passed the theoretical part in October 2010, so a month later he went to Arizona in the United States for the practical part of the course. But Andreas received a letter from the United States Aviation Authority telling him that he couldn't fly because of his past medical history. They asked him for detailed documentation about his depressive episode. He provided it, and finally he managed to get his flight clearance approved. Andreas continued with his practical studies during those years and finally got his license to operate the Germanwings A320 in October 2014. It should be noted that he had been passing the required medical certificate every year. However, throughout all those years, there was still that asterisk that would disqualify him if he had any mental health issues. Since then, he worked as a co-pilot at Germanwings. But if we look at the timeline, only 5 months passed until the date of the transition. Tragedy. What happened in between? It's time to talk about that little asterisk on his medical certificate. You have to understand that generally, being a pilot is a profession that requires a strong sense of vocation. Andreas had overcome all the problems until he achieved his dream job. However, some time ago, when he was still getting his medical license, he went through a depressive episode, which caused a small asterisk to appear in his medical record, an asterisk that weighed heavily. Because if he ever had a similar episode again, he would be completely disqualified from his profession, meaning he would be left without a job. This situation is extremely complex because a mental health problem can be hidden since only you perceive the symptoms. Generally, it can't be noticed from the outside, so basically it would have been Andreas who would have had to report himself, in case a depressive episode happened again, knowing the consequences that would have. So when the problem came back, what do you think he did? He hid it. This relapse began 2 months after he started flying the Airbus A320. The situation, moreover, surely fed itself negatively. Imagine he was unwell, but he couldn't report it, so he was under even more pressure because he had to hide the symptoms. This would make him feel worse, and so on. If at this point he had been able to report his situation, knowing there would be no consequences, he surely would have done it. To be clear, I'm not justifying him hiding his problems, but we should put ourselves in his position to understand him. It's important to mention that Lufthansa had a medical insurance that would cover those 60,000 euros in case a pilot lost their profession due to medical issues. But the insurance would only cover those 60,000 euros, the pilot would have been left without a job. And for that, there were other insurances, so that in case you lost your job due to health problems, these insurances would pay you a certain amount of money every month. Well, when Andreas had previously shown interest in these insurances, they all rejected him as a client because of that small asterisk in his medical record. That's why I say it weighed heavily. Initially, Andreas started to worry since he noticed something with his vision. He couldn't see very well. He made the decision to visit several doctors and get tests done by different eye specialists, but no one found anything unusual. Everything seemed to indicate that it was a side effect of something psychological. Some suggested that maybe he should talk to a psychiatrist, but he never actually did. In addition, Andreas avoided going to aerospace doctors at all times, since he knew perfectly well that if he did, they could take away his license. One of these doctors he went to even pointed out possible psychosis. This is where another big problem in this case appears: doctor-patient confidentiality. When they recommended he see a psychiatrist, they were aware that Andreas had symptoms incompatible with his profession, but they trusted that he would visit a psychiatrist and let it go. The problem is that in Germany, professional confidentiality is extremely serious, and it could have put the doctor in legal trouble if he had contacted the airline. The big problem with all of this is that in each country, this works differently. Although since that case, there have been attempts to establish more direct processes between doctors and airlines. In March, Andreas's psychological condition got much worse, and he had to take several days off. In addition, documents outside the official report indicate that during those days, he began searching the internet for painless ways to end his life. But a few days later, things got noticeably worse in his mind, and something changed, because his internet searches now suddenly were focused on the door locking system of the Airbus A320. Most likely, he already had the idea in his mind. He also wrote several notes on a piece of paper, among which was Barcelona Decision Sunday, Barcelona referring to the Barcelona airport. Clearly, this indicated that he had made the decision to carry out his plan on that flight. On March 24th, he had a round-trip flight to Barcelona scheduled, and he finally carried out his plan on the return journey. But what many people don't know is that he almost did it on the way there. The plane was arriving in Barcelona when the captain left the cockpit to go to the bathroom. He was gone for a total of 5.5 minutes, during which the lives of all the passengers hung by a thread. 30 seconds after the captain left, an air traffic controller contacted Andreas to tell him to descend from 37,000 feet to 35,000. At that moment, he set that value on the altitude selector, but about 20 seconds later, he set it to 100 feet, the lowest possible altitude. The altitude selector stayed there for a few seconds, and then he suddenly raised it again, up to 49,000 feet, which is the maximum, about 14 kilometers high. But moments later, he set it to 35,000, which is what they had told him. But moments later, air traffic control spoke to him and told him to descend to 21,000 feet. So he set that number on the altitude selector, but suddenly he set it back to 100 feet and stayed at that altitude for almost 2 minutes. That is, he was carrying out his plan, but suddenly he set it back to 21,000 feet as if he had come to his senses. But moments later, he lowered it again to 100 and suddenly raised it back up to 21, only to lower it again, until finally he set it permanently at 21,000 feet. 2 seconds later, the door alarm sounded, indicating that someone wanted to come in. It was Commander Andreas. He opened the door and the commander took his seat. Wasn't he aware of what had just happened in the cockpit? It seems as if the co-pilot had been struggling in his mind about whether to do it or not. 30 minutes later, the passengers from that flight left the plane and resumed their normal lives. The passengers who would board a couple of hours later would not be so lucky. After cleaning the inside of the plane and preparing it to return to Dusseldorf, they arrived at the head of runway 06R in Barcelona to receive approval from the control tower and begin takeoff. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the plane took off and everything happened completely normally, climbing up to 38,000 feet of altitude, cruising altitude that had been indicated to them by air traffic control, but at 9 hours, 30 minutes, and 24 seconds. The captain left the cockpit to go to the bathroom since he hadn't had time to do so before takeoff. He went out, closed the door, and it never opened again. At this point, it's important to understand how the cockpit door security system works. Although, mind you, this is all public information, I'm not revealing anything. The cockpit door is made with a honeycomb-type structure made of composite material. The outer layers provide protection against projectile impacts, such as grenades or small-caliber bullets, while the inner layers are designed to absorb and distribute the loads produced by other types of impacts, like blows or kicks. On the outside, there is a keypad that allows you to enter a code on this keypad. In addition, there are two LEDs, one green and one red. Inside the cockpit, the door lock can be controlled thanks to an electrical system, a switch that is in the central part and has three positions: the normal position, the unlock position, and the lock position. In addition, outside the cockpit, there are cameras that allow you to see outside, and that information is displayed to the pilots on screens they have inside the cockpit. To request access to the cockpit when the door is closed, users have to enter a numeric code using the keypad outside. The cabin crew needs to know this code, since it's possible that the pilots might want water, food, or anything else during the flight. When the code is entered correctly, a particular beep sounds inside the cockpit. At that moment, the pilots check the cameras and, if all is normal, switch to the unlock position. To open the door at that moment, the green LED would light up on the outside keypad, and when you push the door, it would open. The problem with this system was the following. If one of the pilots left the cockpit to go to the bathroom, and at that moment the pilot who stayed inside lost consciousness. Upon returning and entering the code, the door would not open, because in order to do so, it was necessary for the switch inside to have been moved to the unlock position. For that reason, there is a second code, known only to the pilots. If it is entered correctly and the switch inside is not activated, after 30 seconds the green LED lights up and the door opens when pushed. This way, the pilot who is outside can re-enter the cockpit in case the one inside has lost consciousness. However, if the switch inside is moved to the lock position, the red LED lights up and the door remains closed. Additionally, the system remains locked for 5 minutes at any time, but if the switch is set to the unlock position, it will open immediately, just in case it was a mistake to put it in the lock position. Knowing this information, you can already imagine what happened that day. 30 seconds after the commander left the cockpit, the co-pilot set the altitude selector to 100 feet. At that moment, the plane reduced engine power to begin descending. Because of that, it's possible that the commander from the bathroom didn't suspect anything, since it's normal for air traffic controllers to ask you to change altitude to avoid air traffic. Something like that. Andreas. In addition, he increased the speed to 307 knots on the speed selector. In the mode the autopilot was operating, the plane would gain that extra speed by lowering the nose even more. The descent rate reached about 3,500 feet per minute on average. For the passengers, the descent would seem controlled, but the captain from the bathroom was possibly starting to think that something strange was going on. Air traffic control contacted the plane, asking what altitude they were heading to, but Andreas did not respond. 4 minutes after leaving the cockpit, the captain requested access to enter. The buzzer sounded inside, but the green light did not turn on. This was when the captain entered the emergency code, expecting the door to open after 30 seconds, assuming that something had happened to the co-pilot inside. But I don't want to imagine what he felt when, suddenly, he saw the light turn on. At that very moment, he understood everything. Andreas had denied him access to the cockpit. In the next few seconds, he started banging on the door, first hoping that the co-pilot would come to his senses. But when he saw that he didn't, the banging on the door grew stronger and stronger, and the audio recordings even captured how the banging stopped being done with a hand and started being done with a piece of metal. Faced with this, Andreas inside didn't flinch. He continued with his plan. The controllers kept trying to communicate with the aircraft without success, and even another commercial plane flying in the area tried to contact them, but there was no response. It must be said that at this point, Andreas no longer had control of the plane. If he regretted it and let the captain in, did he know what had just crashed? The plane crashed in the Alps, 10.5 minutes after the captain left the cockpit and 6.5 minutes after the captain. When the black boxes were recovered and the voice recordings were reviewed, what had happened was discovered. The aviation sector was in complete shock. Never, no one had imagined that the threat was inside the cockpit, much less that the door that opened. He crashed the plane crashed, he watched, crashed into the cockpit crashed it, and in the cockpit, which never happened. The European Aviation Authority, European Aviation Safety Agency, published a recommendation 3 days after the tragedy that there should always be 2 people in the cockpit at all times. That is, if one of the pilots went to the bathroom, one of the flight attendants would have to enter the cockpit during that period of time. Note, this was a recommendation, not an obligation, and the airlines decided whether to implement it or not. A year later, in June 2016, when the whole story that led to the tragedy was already clear, a committee met to evaluate the changes that would occur in aviation and to discuss this recommendation, having 2 people in the cockpit at all times. A study was presented in which they had surveyed 3,783 people from the industry, including flight attendants, pilots, airline staff, and others. The questions concerned the recommendation to always have 2 pilots in the cockpit. Among all those surveyed, 3% were strongly in favor of this recommendation, and 8% were simply in favor. 28% disagreed, and 54% were completely opposed. The remaining 7% had no opinion. You might now be wondering why anyone would be against this new rule. Well, because just like what happened with the doors, maybe this new rule created new risks. Some of these risks are, for example, that flight attendants can't sit in the pilot's seats since they're not qualified to do so. If there were an emergency in that situation, what should they do? Help while standing. And if there were very strong turbulence, they could even accidentally hit a lever or switch. Another important reason is that with this rule, you would be bringing into the cockpit a person who hasn't had to pass the same psychological tests as a pilot. And, therefore, it's possible that if they had malicious intentions, they could have been identified. Finally, after the major disagreement with this recommendation, European Aviation Safety Agency ended up withdrawing it. And today, each airline decides what to do in that situation. Another possible solution was to create a system that would allow a pilot to go to the bathroom without having to close the cockpit door. Over all these years, multiple concepts have been presented. One of them, for example, consists of creating the opportunity for the same psychological tests, which, therefore, if he has the same psychological tests as what should he do? Should he do what? What should he? The pilot would want to go to the bathroom so that he could leave the cockpit door open. This concept has a big problem. And that's because this new door would have to be just as secure as the cockpit door, because if not, someone could wait for it to be used and break it down. Another proposed measure is for the pilot to take a key with him when he goes to the bathroom, a key that would allow him to re-enter the cockpit. But this raises a similar problem. Everyone would know that the pilot carries a key that could open the cockpit, so an attacker could simply wait for that moment to get hold of it. The reality is that the current system is extremely secure, not only because of its effectiveness, which is almost absolute, but also because everyone knows it's impossible to enter the cockpit, and therefore it's a good way to deter any attack. But it's also important to say that the fact that a pilot can't be left alone doesn't prevent them from crashing the plane either. You see, on June 12, 2025, a Boeing 787 was taking off from Ahmedabad in India when both engine shutdown switches were activated. This caused the plane to lose power and crash a few seconds later. The final report on that accident hasn't been released yet, but a lot of evidence points to one of the pilots possibly having turned off the switches. By the way, I'm not saying this to blame one of the pilots, since it hasn't been confirmed yet, but it's to understand that if a pilot really wants to bring down a plane, he has the knowledge to know how to do it without needing to be alone in the cockpit. Therefore, from my point of view, the way to combat this risk should focus mainly on preventing the threat from reaching the cockpit. Since the Germanwings tragedy, new psychological assessment procedures and more random drug and alcohol checks have been created. In addition, programs were created in airlines that allow pilots to share their situation with other colleagues. In case someone is going through a difficult time, I hope that we never, ever have to talk about a case like Germanwings 9525 again.